SuiteFlow Overview. This module provides an overview of the foundational concepts and terminologies associated with business process automation using SuiteFlow. We will begin by reviewing several fundamental business process mapping concepts that will serve as the foundation for understanding the individual building block components of workflows built in SuiteFlow. We will then introduce you to the Workflow Manager, which allows you to create and manage workflow execution and the individual workflow components themselves. In this module, we will discuss the following topics: business process overview, what is SuiteFlow, using the Workflow Manager, modular workflow design, and workflow templates. Upon the completion of this module, you will be able to describe the foundational components of a business process, explain the relationship between workflows and NetSuite record types, list the building blocks of workflows created in SuiteFlow and explain the purpose of each component, and explain the benefits of developing workflows in a modularized fashion. A business process is a collection of linked tasks or activities that, once completed, accomplish some organizational goal. One common example of a simple business process is one that automatically approves sales orders less than $1,000, but requires sales manager approval for orders that are greater than $1,000. Business processes can be visualized as a flowchart, which contains a sequence of tasks or actions, decision points, and rules based on the data being manipulated by the business process itself, and are often represented by different shapes in the flowchart. Additional examples of commonly automated business processes include the auto-routing of records to specific users for approval, auto-approving sales or purchase orders that are less than a specific amount, auto-applying a line item discount when a specific quantity has been purchased or when the total order amount exceeds a specified amount, and auto-creating a task record for a sales rep when a customer's order amount exceeds a specified amount. Most workflows created in SuiteFlow, regardless of their overall complexity, are comprised of the following basic components: initiation or entry states, action states, decision states, sub-processes, although these are typically found in more complex workflows, and completion or end states. Each of these components are often referred to as processing states, in which various actions, decisions, or even sub-processes can be initiated. Separating the specific functions of each component across multiple processing states allows us to create modular workflows that facilitate workflow management. Let's take a closer look at each type of processing state. Initiation or entry states are found in all business processes and represent a state in which the execution of a workflow is initiated. This could be the result of a user action, such as the click of a button, or it could be automatically initiated using a scheduled workflow. Action states represent a task or operation performed at a specific point in the business process. For example, when a record enters an approval workflow, you might set an approval status to pending approval and send the current approver an email notification that a record is waiting for their approval. Decision states ask a question in order to perform some sort of validation on the returned answer. The returned answer determines which actions to execute and which path the workflow follows when transitioning out of the decision state. For example, if the amount is less than $100, change the status to auto-approved. Otherwise, continue with the workflow. Or if a custom checkbox is checked, display a specific field. Otherwise, hide the field. Business processes can trigger the execution of child business processes called sub-workflows, which can perform their own series of actions or tasks. The results of those sub-workflows, a status update for example, could be returned to the parent process, which can then take appropriate action based on the data returned. For example, an approval workflow might check to see if there are more supervisor approvals required. If so, change the supervisor and repeat the approval process for the new supervisor. If there are no more supervisors, change the approval status to approved. And finally, all business processes have an end state, a state in which workflow processing completes. All workflows have at least one end state, but they can have multiple end states, which is common in most approval-based workflows. If you are familiar with popular business process mapping tools such as Microsoft Visio, you may be used to seeing different shapes representing different points in the business process, such as diamonds, triangles, circles, and so on. In SuiteFlow, there is no graphical distinction between processing states. All states are displayed as rectangles. Let's analyze a basic example of an approval-based workflow and discuss what happens at each state of the process. State 1, pending approval, represents the workflow's entry state that initiates the approval process. In this example, there is conditional logic that checks to see if a sales order is less than $5,000. If so, it is automatically approved and routed to State 3, approved. Otherwise, the sales order is routed to State 2 for finance approval. In State 2, the sales order record is locked and approve and reject buttons are added to the form, allowing a finance user to approve or reject the order. If finance approved, the order is routed to State 3, approved. The approval status is updated to approved, and the record could be locked to everyone except the finance manager from this point forward. If rejected by finance, the order is routed to State 4, rejected. The approval status is updated to rejected, and workflow processing completes. Additional processing could be configured to return the sales order back to State 1 for reapproval in the event of initial rejection. So what is SuiteFlow exactly? SuiteFlow is a point-and-click visual workflow development tool used to automate business processes in NetSuite. As we discussed earlier, a workflow is a visual representation of a business process, which includes the tasks, participants, and operations involved at various states of the business process. Workflows can be sequential, with each step of the process contingent upon the completion of the previous step, or they can run in parallel, with different steps of the workflow executing simultaneously in different processing paths. As a workflow transitions between states, actions are performed, such as performing calculations, sending emails, or adding buttons to record forms. Actions and transitions often contain conditional logic that must be satisfied before the action or transition can be performed. When a workflow is initiated on a record, the actions performed at each state, as well as the transitions between the individual states of the workflow, are executed based on triggers, which are specific events that occur as a user is interacting with the record. SuiteFlow supports many business process automation tasks, such as building approval processing workflows with sequential and parallel approvers, sending email notifications, including time-based reminder emails, altering the state of a workflow based on changes to a related record, configuring service-level agreements and drip marketing campaigns, and defining complex business rules and calculations. Workflows have a one-to-one relationship with NetSuite record types. A workflow can only be configured to execute on a single base record type. Workflows are supported by most of NetSuite's standard record types, as well as custom record types. The diagram shown here illustrates how a single workflow executes on a single record type, in this case, an expense report record. This is how SuiteFlow is generally implemented. However, it is possible to create a workflow that executes on specific record subtypes. For example, on the transaction record type, you might have a workflow simultaneously running on the sales order, purchase order, and vendor payment record subtypes, while another workflow runs on the customer record type and the customer, lead, and prospect subtypes. While it is possible to have multiple workflows running on a single base record type, a single workflow cannot execute on two different base record types simultaneously. However, the data associated with other related record types can be accessed and evaluated in workflow conditions using record joins. We will talk more about joins on related records later in this course. As we just mentioned, workflows are supported by most standard NetSuite record types. However, there may be some record types that are not supported by SuiteFlow. The best way to verify if a specific record type is supported is to create a new workflow definition and verify if the desired record type is selectable on the workflow definition page. Automating business processes using SuiteFlow requires an understanding of the foundational components of business processes that we discussed earlier. Let's take these concepts one step further by introducing you to the four primary building blocks of workflows in SuiteFlow: states, actions, transitions, and triggers. Each of the three trigger points shown here correlate to a specific trigger selection made when configuring workflows, actions, and transitions. Trigger type answers the question, when should the workflow be initiated? Trigger on answers the question, when should actions be executed? And transition on answers the question, when should transitions to other states occur? We will discuss each of these trigger points in more detail in the next module. For now, let's take a closer look at each workflow building block. States answer the question, where is the record currently in the business process? Is the business process waiting for a manager to approve or reject a record? Is the business process waiting for a user to save a record after modifying it? Is the business process waiting for the system to retrieve the results of a request from an external system? Actions answer the question, what tasks should be performed in the current state? Should we create a new record? Send an email notification? Automatically update field values and display characteristics of fields on a form? Add approve or reject buttons to a record form? Transitions answer the question, which state should the business process move to next? Should it move to a state representing accounting department approvals after the manager has approved the record? Or should it move to a state representing CFO approval if the purchase order was greater than a specified dollar amount? Or should it move to a state where actions are configured to send additional email notifications? And finally, triggers answer the question, when should a workflow be initiated, an action executed, or a transition performed? Do we want to initiate a workflow when loading a record into the user's browser? Or do we want to return an error message to the user when a purchase order amount is greater than a specified dollar amount? When a record is approved, do we want to transition the record to a state representing final approval? Throughout the remainder of this course, we will be discussing the relationships between each of these workflow building block concepts, as they are fundamental to how workflows are built in SuiteFlow. Speaking of building workflows, let's discuss the Workflow Manager. The Workflow Manager allows you to manage the states, actions, transitions, and custom fields, both workflow and state-level fields, using an intuitive drag-and-drop enabled user interface. The Workflow Manager allows you to graphically represent your business process, much like you would in a traditional business process mapping tool, such as Microsoft Visio. The Workflow Manager is comprised of two primary sections: the workspace and the context panel. The workspace allows you to manage individual workflow states, actions, and transitions, allowing you to arrange the various states of the workflow to better visualize how a record will move through the business process. The Workflow Manager is accessed by navigating to Customization, Workflow, Workflows. From the list of workflows, you can specify whether you want to edit an existing workflow or view it in read-only mode. To modify a workflow's definition, click on the Edit link next to the desired workflow. To view the workflow definition in read-only mode, click on the workflow's name in the list. When in View mode, a workflow's definition and its individual states, actions, and transitions are protected by an Edit button that displays at the top of the Workflow Manager. If you see this button, it is a visual cue that you are viewing the workflow definition in read-only mode. Another indicator is the presence of a drill-down icon next to each individual state, action, and transition in the context panel. Forcing the user to click Edit prevents the accidental modification of a workflow's definition, which could have a detrimental impact on records that currently have those workflows running on them. It's important to note that when creating a new workflow definition, the Workflow Manager will automatically display the workflow in Edit mode. Once you have completed your modifications, you can click the View button to return to read-only mode, or simply navigate away from the Workflow Manager, since all workflow changes are saved continuously when editing the workflow. The Context panel allows you to edit basic workflow properties, states, actions, transitions, and custom workflow and state fields. The Context panel is comprised of the following tabs: Workflow, State, and Transition. Use the Workflow tab to configure workflow properties, initiation parameters, either event-based or scheduled, and event definition parameters, such as trigger type, event type, and various conditions. You can also manage workflow fields, which are used to store data for use within the context of the workflow only. All workflow states have access to values stored in workflow fields. Use the State tab to manage the individual actions configured in individual states. New actions can be configured by clicking the New Action button. Like workflow fields, you can manage state fields, which are used to store data for use within the context of a particular state only. Only the actions in the state containing a custom state field will have access to the values stored in that state field. Use the Transition tab to manage transitions that you create in the Workflow Manager. How a record transitions from one state to another in SuiteFlow can be configured in a variety of ways, either automatically, conditionally, or using button clicks. We will examine many of these transition configuration options later in this course. Now let's briefly discuss some of the benefits of modular workflow design. Actions are always executed within a workflow state. While the number of states in a workflow will vary depending on the complexity of the business process, it is considered a best practice to break up your workflows into smaller, more manageable processing chunks, rather than continuously adding more states, actions, and transitions to existing workflows. While a single workflow can only be configured to run on a single record type, multiple workflows sharing the same base record type can run on a single record of that type as illustrated here. The ability to have multiple workflows running on a single record allows you to tailor the states and actions in each workflow to perform specific types of processing. For example, you might create one workflow that contains only client-side actions during data entry, a second workflow that contains server-side actions on record load, a third workflow that creates new related records during record save, and a fourth workflow that routes the record through an approval process. Workflow modularization is advantageous for the following reasons. Workflows are easier to maintain if you break them up into smaller parts. They allow you to separate client-side action execution from server-side action execution, which ultimately helps facilitate workflow troubleshooting. It also allows workflows to be leveraged as templates to quickly create additional workflows. As you work through the hands-on exercises in this course, you will gain experience building modular workflows that all contribute to the overall processing of a record. Workflow administrators have the option of leveraging workflow templates to facilitate the workflow creation process. These templates include many common approval-based workflows across a variety of transactional records. Instead of developing workflows from scratch, administrators can utilize the most suitable template as a starting point when they create a workflow. The following workflow templates are available: journal entry basic approval, purchase order basic approval, sales order basic approval, and lead nurturing. Each of these basic approval workflows can be created and then modified to meet your specific business requirements. Creating a new workflow from a template is similar to creating a workflow from scratch by navigating to Customization, Workflow, Workflows, and clicking New Workflow. You will then be presented with the option to create the workflow based on a predefined template. Selecting From Template displays the Select Workflow Template page. Selecting one of the delivered templates will generate a workflow containing all the necessary states, actions, conditions, and transitions to get you started. For more information about workflow templates, refer to the Workflow Template reference in the NetSuite Help Center. Before you can access SuiteFlow, you must enable the SuiteFlow feature located on the Suite Cloud subtab. Once enabled, workflows can be created and managed by navigating to Customization, Workflow, Workflows. To create, view, and edit workflows, users must have the workflow permission established on their assigned user role. This permission is established on the Permissions subtab, Setup Sublist, and the only permission level for the workflow permission is full. In addition to the workflow permission, SuiteFlow users must also have sufficient permissions to access the record types associated with the workflows they manage. Here are some key things to remember when getting started with SuiteFlow. Multiple workflows can run on a single record type, but a single workflow cannot run on two different record types simultaneously. There is no limit to the number of workflows that can run on a single record type in SuiteFlow. States answer the question, where is the record currently in the business process? Actions answer the question, what tasks should be performed in the current state? Transitions answers the question, which state should the business process move to next? Triggers answers the question, when should a workflow be initiated, an action executed, or a transition performed? Adopting a modular workflow design approach results in easier workflow maintenance and facilitates workflow troubleshooting by separating client-side action execution from server-side action execution. Workflow templates allow you to quickly create common approval processing workflows that can be modified to meet your specific workflow requirements. SuiteFlow users must have the workflow permission on their assigned user role and have sufficient permissions to access the records on which they will be creating workflows. In this walkthrough, we will verify the enablement of the SuiteFlow feature in our training account and examine the NetSuite permissions required to access SuiteFlow. Before we can begin working with SuiteFlow, we do need to make sure that we have the proper features and permission set in our training account. So let's talk about the features required first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to Setup. I'm going to come down to Company, and I'm going to choose Enable Features. So Setup, Company, Enable Features. And the SuiteFlow feature will be found on the Suite Cloud subtab all the way over here on the right-hand side. And if I scroll down just a little bit, there'll be a whole section here for SuiteFlow, and you can see that the SuiteFlow feature has already been enabled in our account. Now, as such, if I come up here to the Customization tab, you can see that I do in fact have a Workflows option here, and if I click New, it'll take me to the Workflow Manager, or at least a list of workflows where I can create a new workflow. So as long as you have that option off the Customization tab for Workflow, you know that the feature has been enabled in your training account. So there's nothing for me to change here, so I'm going to go ahead and click Cancel. Now let's examine the required permissions for SuiteFlow. And there's really only one to take a look at. And to see that permission, I'm going to navigate to Setup, Users and Roles, Manage Roles. So again, that's Setup, Users and Roles, Manage Roles. And I'm just going to go ahead and customize one of the standard delivered NetSuite roles here, such as Accountant. I'm just going to click Customize. And as you may know, best practices dictate that you should always customize the delivered user roles to create custom user roles and then adjust your permissions on those custom user roles. To set the workflow permission, I'm going to scroll down here to the Permissions subtab, and I'm going to select the Setup sublist. And this is where you will find the workflow permission. So if I just go ahead and click on this drop-down list and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see that in fact we do have an entry for workflow down there. If I select it, notice that the default permission level, or the only permission level in this case, is full. So users with this permission will have access to SuiteFlow or they won't. It just depends on if the permission is present on their user role or not. So that is really all you have to do to ensure that your SuiteFlow users have access to the tool. And once you've set that, you can certainly click Save. Now, in my case, we're not going to work with any custom user roles. We're going to do most of our work with Larry Nelson and use any built-in assigned user roles for our employee users. So there's nothing to really save here, but I did want to show you the workflow permission. Now, I should also mention that the permissions that are assigned to your user roles are enforced by SuiteFlow. So if a user does not have access to record data and fields on record forms due to their permissions on their user roles, that can affect how they interact with various record forms. So just make sure your user roles that are assigned to your various users across your organization do have the appropriate record level permissions so they don't encounter processing errors when working with records that may have workflows running on them. In this walkthrough, we will review the Suite Builder components associated with the Custom Performance Review business process. We will also examine each of the pre-built performance review workflows that will serve as the basis for all walkthrough demonstrations performed during this course. The first thing that we're going to do here is examine the performance review custom record itself. And to do that, I'm going to navigate to Customization, Lists, Records, and Fields. And I'm going to come down here to Record Types. So Customization, Lists, Records, and Fields, Record Types. And you can see that we do have a small handful of custom record types in this training account. You can see that your furniture request record out here, as well as your furniture request solution records are both present, as well as our performance review and performance review demo records. Now I'm going to be using the demo record to kind of show you how the performance review process works for this particular demonstration, but when I go through the remaining walkthrough demonstrations and I start building workflows, I'll be building those workflows on our performance review record. Okay, but they are virtually identical with the exception of the name and the ID. So just note that. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and click on Performance Review Demo. Again, these are identical. And the first thing that I just want to point out is not to get into the details of how this record is configured, but I do want to discuss the nature of the fields that you're seeing down here on the record. So we have a subordinate field. Notice that that field is actually a join out to the employee record. So those of you that are familiar with Suite Builder and creating custom records know that when you come out here and add fields and then link them through list record type fields, you are creating a join to those records in this case. So we have a join to the employee record. We also have a join out here to the task record, as you can see down here. And we have a variety of other types of fields. Some of these fields are of various types. We have date fields, we have free-form text fields, currency fields, so on and so forth. Some of these fields are also mandatory. So for example, if I come in here and I select review type, and I come down here to validation and defaulting, notice that that is actually enabled as a mandatory field. Now I could certainly make fields mandatory and optional using SuiteFlow specifically, but this just shows you that you can make fields statically mandatory or optional on the record itself. Okay, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later in the course. But I just wanted to orient you to some of the fields that you're seeing here on the record itself, as well as the joins specifically, in this case, employee and task. Now, if I go and create a new performance review demo record, which I'm going to do right now. So if I come up here to Lists, Custom, notice I have access to not only our furniture request records, but also our performance review records. I'm just going to choose Performance Review Demo, New, and I'm going to open that up in a new browser tab. Okay. And the first thing that I want to point out is, notice that a new Performance Review Demo form is presented here. You'll notice that there are some various things happening. Notice that I do have several required fields. One of them we actually just looked at, and that was review type that we had set at the record level as being mandatory. We also have some default values being set, as well as our date auto-populating as well. So there is some stuff going on here in the background with regards to workflow processing. Let's go ahead and take a look at the actual workflows that are built on this simple record and kind of see what's going on here. So back on the other tab, I'm just going to go ahead and navigate out to our list of workflows. And to do that, I'm going to go to Customization, Workflow, Workflows. Okay, it brings me to the Workflows list where I can filter my workflows by record type if I want to. I can do it by other options as well, as you can see here, but record type will work for us. And I'm simply going to come down here and filter on Performance Review Demo. Okay, right down here. And here are the workflows that are, many of which are actually running on our Performance Review Demo record right now. So you can see that I have a Performance Review Entry, Load, Save, and Approval workflows. Okay, there it is right there, that are all running on this record type. For now, let's focus our attention on the entry workflow. I'm just going to go ahead and open that up in view mode. I don't need to make any changes to it. And the only thing that I want to kind of do here in this demonstration is correlate what you're seeing here in the workflow configuration with those actions effects on the actual record form itself. So if I come back here, notice we have a single state workflow with a series of actions. Notice that I have one action here called Set Field Value, which is setting the value of the review date field to the end of next week. And that's once I come into this record form, set the date field to end of next week. Is it in fact doing that? Let's see. And it is. I'm recording this on June 3rd, and you can clearly see that it is actually pushing it out a week here. Okay. If I go back, we have a set field display label action that's been configured to change the field label of the name field, as you can see there, to review period. Let's see if that's working. If I go back over to my form, notice that this field is actually, it should be name, but I'm overriding it to say review period. Okay. Again, some more actions configured in the simple workflow. We have some set field display type actions. One that sets the salary increase amount field to display normally when the review type is salary change. However, when the review type is no salary change, we should hide the salary increase amount field. Let's see if that works. So if I jump back over here to our form and I change the review type to no salary change, notice that the salary increase amount is hidden. If I change it back to salary change, salary increase amount is displayed as normal. We have some field mandatory actions in here. So as you can see, rating code is being set to mandatory or equal to true, again, when the review type is salary change, and when the review type is no salary change, we're making the rating code optional. So let's go verify that as well. So again, notice that salary change is forcing rating code to be mandatory, but if I change that, now rating code is optional. And finally, if I come back here, there's one more action configured in this very brief entry workflow called return user error. And that simply is saying that if I enter a salary increase amount that's greater than $10,000, we should throw an error to the user. So let's go ahead and see if that works. I'm going to come over here to the record. I am just going to go ahead and enter some basic text here just so I can try to save the record. I'll enter a rating code, and I'll enter a salary increase amount of $11,000. And let's see if I can save it. Notice it tells me salary increase amount cannot be greater than $10,000. So that's working really well. So that gives you some idea of how one workflow, one single state workflow with a few configured actions can be used to control and manipulate how fields are displayed on entry forms when we're working in NetSuite. We're going to talk a lot more about this and configure some of these actions from scratch as we start building our workflows in the next module. In this walkthrough, we will demonstrate the Workflow Manager user interface and create a simple workflow based on the custom performance review record. Now let's take a few minutes to review the general interface here in SuiteFlow, namely talk about the workspace and the context panel. And then we'll go ahead and create our first workflow of this course, which will just introduce you to some of these various interface components here. So again, on the left side of the Workflow Manager, we do see the workspace, which is where you can visually see the layout of the business process itself. And you can see now from this particular view, I'm actually in view mode. Okay, and I can see that because I have an edit button up here above the workspace. Now notice that I can't change anything about this workflow because I'm in view mode. So notice I can't drag and move this state around no matter how much I click and try to drag it. Notice that when I select a action here, notice I have no ability to change the action's configuration. Okay, again, all I can do is just look at the configuration and then close the window. So this is very much in read-only mode. So if I want to be able to modify this workflow, I simply need to click on Edit. Now notice that that button changes to View. I get a new state button that gets added to the workspace, and now I can click and drag the states around. I can create new states. I can move them where I want them. I can create new transitions. Well, actually, I can't in this case because this is a non-exiting end state, but that's okay. I can remove states. I can do anything I want to this workflow. So when you have no states here in the workspace selected, notice that the only tab you have in the context panel is Workflow. So if I want to look at the workflow's configuration or its definition, I simply click on the little edit icon on the Workflow tab, just like this. And now I can see the actual configuration. So here we have our logging options here, which we'll talk quite a bit about later in this course. We have our initiation parameters. When is this workflow going to initiate on this record? Any conditions that must be met before that initiation can occur, so on and so forth. Again, we're going to go into much detail on these options a little bit later. If I select a state in the workspace, again, the context panel, hence the name, the context changes to the state itself. So now notice I not only have a workflow tab that I can toggle to and update, but I also have a state tab, which allows me to edit the nature of the state configuration. So if I click on the edit icon here, I can not only change some various options for the state itself, but I can also manage the individual actions and transitions and state fields that may exist in this state. Now notice we don't have any state fields. We don't have any transitions because this is a single state workflow, but we certainly have several configured actions, many of which we looked at just a moment ago. Okay, set field value, set field display label, set field display type, and return user error. Now let me show you one other thing here. If I just navigate back to the list of workflows, and you can do that a couple different ways. If you want to go up to customization workflows, you can certainly do that, but there's a handy little list link right here above the context panel that you can click on that will take you directly to the list of workflows. If I select the link for the actual workflow name, for example, this performance review demo save workflow, if I click on its link, notice it opens this workflow up in view mode. How do I know that? Again, notice the edit button. However, if I click on the actual edit link next to one of these workflows, it opens it obviously up in edit mode. And I can see that because I have a view button. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you're working in the workflow list. Let's go ahead and create a new workflow. And this is going to be the first workflow that we create. And it's going to be a very simple one-state workflow with one basic action. And this will just allow us to kind of get a feeling for working in the workspace, working in the context panel, and working with the state configuration and the action configuration forms. So what I'm going to do here is simply click New Workflow. The name of the workflow that I'm going to create, I'm going to call this Performance Review Entry 02. And I'm just putting the 02 on the end to illustrate this is like Module 2 of the course, just so I can differentiate the various workflows that I'm going to be creating during these demonstrations. I'm going to enter a workflow ID as follows. We'll talk a little bit more about workflow IDs a little bit later, but they are, I would say, it's not a required field, but in my opinion, it is. It should be. Record type, I'm going to choose Performance Review. Notice that this particular record type does not have any subtypes, but if it did, I could select them from here. So for example, if I had selected Transaction as the record type, notice I have a lot of different record subtypes I can select. So do I want this to run on cash sale or sales orders or purchase orders or invoices? If I change this to customer, for instance, do I want to have this run on the subtypes of just customer or maybe leads and prospects as well? Okay, so different record types will have different subtypes depending on the record. Let me go back and select my performance review record. And I'm going to go ahead and enter in a very basic description. Okay, always a good idea to enter descriptive text for these workflows. I'm going to set the release status of this to testing. Again, more on this a little bit later. And I'll go ahead and enable logging, just in case we want to look at logs later. We'll talk about that more later. I want this workflow to initiate when we create a new performance review record. And that's it. That's the only time I want this workflow to initiate is when the user selects New from the user interface. Okay, and that's all I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do now is just save this definition. There's my single state that it creates for me by default. So what I'm going to do now is select the state. I can do that a couple different ways. I can double click on it to open the state definition up, or as I showed you earlier, I can come over here to the State tab and click on the Edit icon. And I'm just going to rename this State 1 Data Entry. Just like that. And I'm going to click Save. Now I certainly could, let me go back there, I could certainly enter a description for the state as well. Again, less important to me personally, but again, it's always a good idea to enter description fields. I'm not going to be populating those as we work through the course for the interest of time, but otherwise I would recommend you do so. And now let's go ahead and add an action to this state. So in order to add an action, I have to actually select the state that I want to contain the action. So notice that I don't have a new state button over here in the context panel until I select a state, and then I see the button. So I'm going to go ahead and click New Action. And the action that we're going to go ahead and configure is going to be a very simple Show Message action. All the way down here, notice I have a link for Show Message. These are all the supported actions in SuiteFlow. And I'm going to come over here and click Show Message. Okay, it pops up a parameters field here. It says, all right, what do you want to display to the user when they create this new record? And I'm just going to go ahead and enter some text in here that says, please complete your annual performance review. And that's all I'm going to do. I certainly could put a condition. So only show this when a certain condition or set of criteria has been met. We're going to talk about conditions a lot more in this course. But for now, I just want to show a message to the user when they create a new record. And that's it. I'm going to click Save. On that action configuration, notice that that action is listed over here in the context panel under the Before User Edit Trigger event. We'll talk more about that here shortly. And now let's just go ahead and execute this workflow by creating a new performance review record. So notice I don't even need to save or do anything. This is all dynamically saved as I work in the workflow manager. There's no save button. Okay, so everything is all ready to go. So all I have to do is come to Lists, Custom, Performance Review, New. I'm going to open that in a new tab and watch what happens. The form is loaded and the message is immediately displayed. Please complete your annual performance review. Now notice all I can do as the user is simply go, oh, okay, makes sense to me, click OK, and I can continue with my performance review entry. If I reload this form, if I do a Control F5 in my browser, this would be Command R if you're on Mac OS, to reload this browser page, notice that I get the same message displayed again, okay, on the new record. So client-side actions, you can actually affect the reinitiation of client-side actions simply by refreshing your local browser cache. That is not the case with server-side actions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you make changes to client-side actions, in this case our workflow with our client-side show message action, if I want to edit that, and maybe I want to change that from annual to quarterly performance review, it's going to change the nature of the message in that configured action. I can simply jump back to that entry form, do a refresh in my browser, and that change is immediately reflected on the reloading of that record form. So be aware of that as you're working with your client-side actions. Those Control F5s can save you a lot of time when you're testing your local actions. So that is just one really simple example of a basic workflow. Obviously, we're going to go into much more detail and much more complexity throughout this course. But that at least gives you an idea of sort of how to work around here in the workspace, how to use the context panel, as well as the individual tabs that will be displayed in the context panel. It is now time for you to complete the required hands-on exercises associated with the topics discussed in this module. To complete the required exercises, refer to your student workbook. When you have finished, you may continue with the next module. This concludes the SuiteFlow Overview module.